what happened to KQ shares? Because back in 2020, the airline was suspended from trading in the Nairobi Securities Exchange market. So you could not buy or sell any shares then. 5 years later, that is in January 2025, you can now buy and sell their shares. So let's dive deeper to understand what happened to this airline. March 1996, the state-owned corporation, which is 100% owned by the government, is sold. The government remains with 23%, around 23%, and 29%, or rather 26%, is sold to a Dutch airline known as KLM. Now we have 51% remaining that is sold to the public. We as investors can now buy shares in the airline. So the company does well, it performs well, it pays out dividends faithfully. In 2009, the airline starts to have financial troubles. But despite that, it decides to pay out dividends. So that's not a cause for alarm. In 2013, for the first time in 14 years, that is from 1999, the airline is not able to pay out dividends. So stock investors are like, what's happening? What's happening? Because for the last 14 years, the airline has been paying out dividends. Why didn't I receive the dividends? It is then discovered that the airline incurred 7.86 billion as a loss. This is the biggest that has ever been seen in the Nairobi Securities Exchange market. Because in the previous year, that is 2012, the airline had made 1.66 billion as profit. So what happened? Because we had 1.66 billion as profit the previous year, now we have a loss of 7.86 billion. That's a whopping number. And what's even interesting is that back in 2011, that is 2 years before they incurred a loss, the dividend payout was 1.50 shillings. That is in 2011. In 2012, it dropped to 0.25 shillings as the dividends. So now in 2013, they're not paying out dividends. You can even see that there's that history of the decline of the reducing dividend payout from 1.5 to 0.25. Now it's a zero. The airline has to explain why they have incurred losses. And the management comes up with several reasons. One is that there's the Eurozone debt crisis. There was a debt crisis that was going on in Europe, sort of like a recession, which affected the passengers that were coming to Africa, the tourists that were coming to Africa. And this was one of the reasons that the number of passengers that were boarding the airline had reduced. So the revenues reduced in terms of the ticket sales, in terms of the cargo. The other reason was there were fears regarding the elections. However, we had peaceful elections. Everything went well. Also, the cost of fuel went down. And plus now we had travel advisories that were telling their passengers, okay, Kenya is safe. You can come to Kenya. You can board their airline. But despite this good climate, the airline still incurred losses. So what was the issue other than the issues that were cited? It turns out that back in 2012, the airline had launched a project known as Project Mawingu. Now listen to the plans of this project. It was to make Nairobi become the hub of flights, not only in Africa, but also in the East. So we are talking about India and China. This was a very ambitious plan. They were planning to have over 115 destinations. They were planning to cut across 77 countries. They were planning to operate in 6 continents. All of this was to be achieved by 2021. This was back in 2012 and the draft was in 2011. So we're talking about 10 years down the line in 2021. All this was to be achieved. But in order for this project to be achieved, it needed money. So the airline borrowed money externally and internally. We had banks that lent out money to this institution. And for Project Mawingu to also be realized, there were also alliances that were to be formed. We had Air France alongside KLM. You remember KLM, the Dutch airline. And alongside other airlines, they were to work together to realize this dream, the pride of Africa. But what this project didn't take into account, apart from it requiring a lot of finances to realize this, was that the skies were not going to be open for KQ. Remember, for you to get to 115 destinations, for you to fly across 77 countries, for you to be the pride of Africa, there's going to be competition. You are the new kid in the block. Some airlines are going to have cheaper tickets. Another issue arose. There was the Ebola crisis in the West, in West Africa. I think you remember that case. So because of this Ebola crisis, this airline was banned from using the Sierra Leone and the Liberian routes. Remember, they are planning to fly across Africa. So with the closure of these routes, they lost millions in revenue. Millions in revenue. There are also other issues. They had bought planes, which was another operational cost. They bought Boeing. They made another blunder. They hedged on fuel. It's a common practice in the aviation industry where a certain airline can say, okay, give us this price for fuel for the next 10 years. If the prices go up, if the prices go down, we don't care, just give us this price. Most of the time when you hedge the price for fuel is that you are anticipating that the price would go up. So there's always a loser, there's always a winner. Since you had set the price for the fuel for the next 10 years, for the next 5 years, and the price goes up, you win. These other airlines that haven't hedged the fuel price, the fuel cost, they lose because the cost has gone up. So for you, the cost of fuel is going to be cheaper. And this is going to affect your performance in terms of net profit and that kind of analysis. But little did they know that the prices for fuel would go down. Remember, they had hedged the cost of fuel, the price for fuel. So they incurred losses. And these other airlines that had not hedged, it became cheaper for them. With the oil prices taking a downward trend, now we are in 2020. We have COVID. Passengers are not traveling like they used to. So there's the reduction in revenues. This was the final draw. It's 2020, the government decides to rescue this organization. The government had a plan in mind. They wanted it to be a fully state-owned corporation, 100% owned by the government. But then there were legality issues that didn't allow that. So the government came up with a plan and the company was delisted from the Nairobi Securities Exchange. You could no longer buy or sell shares there. And the plan was, one, the National Treasury was to take on part of the debt. So they were going to be responsible for paying on these debts that Kenya Airways had incurred. Remember, they had bought planes. Remember, they had borrowed money externally to become the pride of Africa, to scale across Africa. The other thing was that as a result of this, the government converted those loans to shareholdings. So the government loans became now shares. And this diluted the shares that the other company, you remember KLM, the KLM Dutch Airlines, this diluted their shares. So now they were owning 7.8% from the 29%. Was it 26% that they had bought? The other thing was that there were banks here in Kenya which had loaned Kenya Airways. We had Equity, we had Corp, we had I&M, we had different companies that had loaned them money. But remember, the airline is now incurring losses. So how are these banks going to get back their money? Part of the debts were converted to treasury bonds. It was an agreement that was done between them and the government. So they were going to get back their money by lengthening the repayment process, and they would be earning interest, just the typical way how bonds work. And also part of this debt was converted to shares. So these companies were given stakes in Kenya Airways. They now own the company. They now own part of the company of Kenya Airways. So I think it doesn't make sense for them because they wanted to make money, but what could they do? It's important because later on, now that Kenya Airways is back in the stock exchange market, these companies, or rather these banks that now have shares as a result of the restructuring, now have the opportunity to sell those shares to us as investors. So the question is, now that we have KQ back in the NSE market, is the company profitable? Yes, the company is profitable. Listen to this. In the first half of 2024, that was before it was listed in the NSE because it was listed in 2025. In the first half of 2024, they made 513 million as net profit. net profit. They've bounced back to profitability. They are no longer making losses. What's interesting is that a year before, that is in 2023, guess what? They made 21.7 billion loss. That's the net loss. So you can see that jump from 21.7 billion net loss to 513 million net profit. The last profit for KQ was paid out in 2013. Or rather, the last profit that KQ made was back in 2013, where for the first half of the year, they made 384 million. So you can see before their downfall, they made 384 million. They fell down. They had 21.7 billion as a loss. And for the first half of 2024, they now have 513 million, which I think is a great thing. So what led to them becoming profitable? Why are they profitable in 2024 such that these other years they are not profitable? This airline had foreign currency debt. They had debt in dollars. Now, the issue with foreign currency debt is that there's always that issue of foreign exchange. If you owe somebody as debt in USD, you have to pay them back in USD. So what the government did is that they negotiated in terms of paying this debt. It was going to be paid in local currency instead of the USD payment. So if the currencies fluctuate, it's still going to be easy for them, for the government to pay off these loans. So that's one of the costs that has been offset for them. What about the stock price? Because this is what we are interested in as investors. Before the company was delisted in the NSE, the price was 3.83. So when it was reopened last month, that is in January 2025, the price of the stock was 3.83. It opened with the same price and it went up to as high as 8.36 shillings. So currently, as at Feb 24th, that is yesterday, Feb 24th, the value of the stock is 5.46. So we can see that it has increased and that's a good thing. I watched a video where the late Chris Kirubi, the billionaire, was talking about why he bought shares at KQ shortly after they had announced a loss, a net loss. Why would an investor want to invest in a company that has already said they're making losses? So for him, it was more of supporting the economy. He thought about another airline, even gave an example of Ethiopian Airlines. Imagine we now don't have KQ and we have to rely on Ethiopian Airlines to be our main national carrier. How would that look like? So for him, it was about investing in a company that is ours, the pride of Africa. He also talked about management issues, that the airline had a lot of operational costs that could have been cut. He talked about the salaries of these pilots, that in as much as they were restructuring, the salaries should also be reduced. For him, he felt that the officials who were managing this company were not putting their best foot forward. In fact, in the West, if the management has failed, they resign. But for us as Kenyans, we can't resign. We still hang on to the office. He also talked about the cost of the tickets, that why would an airline like ours charge a very high price when we have Ethiopian Airlines that is charging 3 times less? Any rational passenger would go for this other carrier and leave out KQ. And what do you think went wrong? According to you, what went wrong with this airline and what can we do better? Thank you for watching. Like this video and see you in the next one.